Now that we have bloodied the battlefield with all these arbitrary casualties, let's move on to the 10 titles that do actually make the final cut. And although I say 10 because top 10 sounds good, it's going to be a couple more. Those of you who've watched other list videos of mine know that I don't really believe in ranking things. I mean, selecting 10 is hard enough, but I also like to make lists that are spread out, which means that if you don't like this, you will maybe like this. If you don't like these two, you may like the third one. So I do try to make things that will appeal to everyone. So ranking them against each other just doesn't make sense to me. However, I do need an order to go in. So for this list, I'm going to go from the most famous comic to what I think is the least known. Again, this is not a judgment of quality. This is just as far as what I see people talking about, which names I see get mentioned more often. And you could probably say, oh, number 3 should be number 2 and number 2 is far less known. It's only about what I know. So going from most well-known to least, number 10 on my list is Fables, written by Bill Willingham and illustrated by a number of artists, primarily Mark Buckingham. Fables is an absolute delight. It's a long-running series featuring fairy tale characters who've been forced to flee their homelands and take refuge in New York City, where they've apparently been for over 100 years. These immortal beings live amongst us, hidden from sight through the use of magic and the vast fortunes that they've been able to smuggle out of their homelands. And that setup, which already sounds good enough, is exploited wonderfully in this series. Bill Willingham doesn't rest on what you know of Snow White and Rose Red or Cinderella or Prince Charming from the stories. He uses that as a launching pad to establish who these people are, but very quickly proves that they are very different, very individual characters, and the stories that he tells with them in this struggle against this evil force, as well as trying to live in this world, is pure joy because of the level of invention he displays. Fables takes stories that you are very familiar with, Cinderella, Snow White. He takes nursery rhymes, Boy Blue and King Cole, people who've only been mentioned once or twice, The Frog Prince, and turns almost every one of them into some sort of a heroic figure, achieving incredible goals, making tremendous sacrifices. The good guys don't always behave like good guys. The bad guys don't always behave like bad guys, and it's this subversion of expectation of what you know from the fairy tales in this new and absolutely original story that gives it its zing. What I also like about Fables is in including characters, how it throws open the gates of what is a fable, what is a fairy tale. You have human and animal creatures from Aesop's Fables. You have them from myth and legend. You have characters from Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser make an appearance. A little bit of a personal note over here. As a child in India, I grew up reading a lot of Russian fairy tales and folk tales. I was as familiar with Tales from the Embassy and Ukrainian folk tales and stories of Ivan and the Firebird or Emilia and the Pike as I was of Greek and Indian mythology. And one of the things that I love the most about Fables is the way that they incorporate not just Baba Yaga, who's a major character, but also the horsemen who are dusk and dawn and midnight. The fact that so many cultures, myths, and legends get woven into these stories, and the way that they're reinvented makes Fables an absolute blast. There are, I think, 20 or 21 trade paperbacks of Fables. They're in deluxe editions, and only one of them is a miss. Everything else is right on the money, and at its peak, it's some of the best adventure fantasy comics that you will ever read. So that's number 10, Fables. Over here, I'd like to give a quick honorable mention, something that's very similar to Fables, something that precedes it in a way, which is Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill's The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Similar to Fables in the way that Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill take the pantheon of literary characters, starting with 18th, 19th century characters like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Mina Murray from Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Invisible Man from H.G. Wells, and blend it together with a covert government unit. It does have elements of science fiction, it does have elements of steampunk, and as much as I love parts of it, the first volume, the second volume, some of the later century volumes, there are other parts of it that are not as appealing to me. Alan Moore, of course, is a big brain, and his reinvention of these characters and his use of these characters in these new stories is still a fantastic job in revisionist and original storytelling. But as cerebral and as accomplished as the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is, I think I just enjoyed reading Fables and many more volumes of Fables, which is why Fables takes the spot. Number 9 on my list of top 10 fantasy comics is Elfquest, written and drawn by Wendy Pini and Richard Pini. This is sort of one of the grandfathers of independent comics publishing. This is a self-published epic fantasy that ran across many years and many issues to tell a serious, grown-up, adult fantasy story. Its reputation with what it did with self-publishing matches its reputation for storytelling. It takes itself very seriously. Its attention to characters is as detailed as its attention to its world and rules. One of the things that I love about it is no matter who you're following, you're very invested in the way they think, in the way that they're going to make a decision. You're never thinking that's what I would do in this situation or this is what they need to do for the story. The story comes from these characters, even though it has these fantastical elements, even though it has politics, even though it has interactions of all kinds. As an example, when I was reading Elfquest, one of the things that impressed me most is how one of the protagonists leads this band of elves in this epic travels with a quest in mind. He meets a female elf, a queen of a tribe, and they have this incredible chemistry and they fall in love, and then they separate and go their own ways because they have separate destinies. There is no pining and there's no tragedy. If they encounter each other again, they're still in love, they have other relationships, and this notion of how they can consider themselves soulmates and still be apart is just alien enough and strange enough to be the kind of cultural insight that we expect from fantasy stories. How these two apart and these two together propel the narrative forward is one of the many reasons that makes Elfquest such a complex and wonderful fantasy comic. Not a lot of people talk about Elfquest these days. I'm really glad that Dark Horse has published all of the Elfquest stories, but they're also the original full epic saga is available online for free to read. This is one of those books that proves how fantasy can be great, how comics can be great, and how fantasy comics can be great. Number 8 on this list is Beautiful Darkness by Fabian Wellman and Kara Sowitt. This is one of those comics that I had to think a little about. It is fantastical, but it's not outright magic. But you see the story of these tiny little creatures, sort of like the Borrowers, if you've read the book or watched those movies. These tiny little humanoid creatures that suddenly find themselves in the middle of a forest. How they came to be there, where they've come from, is slowly revealed sort of in the background of the story, and it's creepy and weird and really gets under your skin. And then what happens to these creatures, what they do and what is done to them unfolds like a horror story. But the reason it's one of my favorite fantasy comics is that it's obviously playing with certain notions or certain things that we're familiar with. These little creatures that look like fairies or sprites or, steal your things when you're not looking and have little cultures and little worlds out there is a trope or is something that we've seen in a number of stories. But the way that this book looks at them, like they're childlike and lost, but also cruel and violent, the way their obliviousness to the cruel realities of the world, having been sheltered in a very macabre way until now, the way that these obliviousnesses translate into death or worse for them seems to be almost inverting that dangerous world of fantasy look, where it's the real world that's the danger to the fantastical creatures. I've very rarely read something so accomplished with so little. The whole thing feels like a little bright, sunshiny in the forest fairy tale with terrible, horrible things happening. As I said, getting under your skin, creeping you out, but at the same time, you're glued to the pages. You've got to see what new catastrophe unfolds next. And for something this slim, which also has very little text, and what text you have is very plainly spoken, very deadpan, it's quite difficult to describe how effective it is. And since I like tacking on honorable mentions at every given opportunity, opportunity, I'd also like to mention Satania, also written by Fabian Wellman and illustrated by Kara Sowitt. If Beautiful Darkness was their take on The Borrower, Satania is a very strange interpretation of Journey to the Center of the Earth. Like with Beautiful Darkness, but on a much more epic scale, we get some very strange situations, some very unexpected relationships, but in this case with a group of humans who are venturing further and further into unknown territory. To say anything more would slightly ruin the book, because the charm is in seeing what happens next, in not having any clue what's coming, and all delivered in this simultaneously gorgeous and creepy style. And making it a Kara Sowitt trifecta, I would also highly recommend Beauty, in which they collaborate with Hubert. This is a fractured fairy tale in which the wish of a woman to be gorgeous, to be beautiful, comes true, but with consequences that no one sees coming. What I like about all three of these books is the way that they use fantasy to tell stories that have cruelty, that have ugliness, that have meanness in them. It's not all just magic and pretty, but at the same time, it's not grim. Maybe it's what people refer to as the European sensibility, especially when contrasted against very mainstream American storytelling, where black and white are clearly defined. And even if you have an anti hero, or even if you have something gritty, it always has to be psychologically explained, and you have to get a reason why someone is the way they are. And there is a certain amount of glamorization, no matter how bad the behavior. Over here, in these stories, the cruelty feels like cruelty, but also feels like everyday. The magic and the mundane are so next to each other that it's difficult to tell which one is which. And the fantastical elements serve to give us a filter on our own behavior and worlds. These are very unusual stories that don't rely on preconceived notions or judgments to get their power. And although officially speaking, I'm putting Beautiful Darkness on my list, Satania and Beauty are equally worth checking out. Number 7 on my list is Delphine, written and drawn by Richard Sala. Richard Sala is one of my favorite writer artists, and my love for him began with this book. Delphine is a take on Snow White done in beautiful duotone brushes by Richard Sala, in which he takes his trademark use of gothic imagery and shadows and sinewy branches, but imbues them with this kind of cartoonish innocence, and the effect of putting these two things together is truly spectacular. Delphine is full of dread, but at the same time, it is also leisurely and gently paced, which helps build the suspense and tension and the perplexity of the reader. What is going on over here? To some terrific levels. It takes the point of view of the Prince Charming character, who is a man looking for a woman that he knew in college, that he had a relationship with, but many years ago left him to go back to her home country and never returned. Having traveled to her home country and hometown, which is sort of like Transylvania and very reminiscent in many ways of those 1950s Hollywood horror films, he travels over and finds himself in one peculiar situation after the other. They're all creepy. Some of them explode into violence in very unexpected ways, but throughout this are interspersed flashbacks to his life and interactions with Delphine, the girl he's looking for. What I love about this comic is how, again, it takes these elements of fantasy, the elements of the scary woods and strange old ladies and creepy old men and graveyards and burials, and then spins a story which is about a broken relationship, about insecurities, about abandonment. The way that the story takes a break to go into what seem like pretty mundane relationship conversations in the past for extended periods of time may seem a little weird first. Like, I was in the middle of that, why am I getting this? But by the time you get to the end of the story, by the time you see where it ends up, when you see how things turn out, it all starts making a very strange and beautiful sense. I have very rarely seen something so adroitly done with such ambition, but which the presentation edition of looks almost simple. Here's a dark little fantasy. Here's a dark little story about a creepy village and a woman gone missing. Every time I've read this, whether it is in this collected hardcover edition or the larger size single issues published by Fantagraphics, every time I've read it, I've found new things which strike me as just so subtle and so much in the background, and then once you notice them, you're like, how couldn't I have seen this before? I understand this so much better. For something that's this thin, and even there, a lot of the pages are just that one scene unfolding, someone climbing the stairs, someone going down into the basement. Page after page takes its time, and then the story ends, and you're not quite sure what it is you've read. That's the kind of richness that I love about the comics medium, how a page that seems simple can have so much packed into it, and no one really does it more disarmingly than Richard Sala. Very similar in effect but completely different in execution is The Lagoon by Lily Carey. Lily Carey writes gentle, poetic short stories that could be magical realism if they weren't so imbued with the fantastic. It's not just one element. The world itself seems to be built up of magical elements, but is also very recognizable as being our world. The Lagoon is a full-length story, unlike the shorter pieces, although still about as thin as Delphine, and tells the story of a community of people who hear a song from the lagoon every night. The art style is deep and inky, but also scratchy, and it perfectly complements this narrative of something hidden, something under the water, something in the woods, and the strange allure that we have towards it. Just the way that Delphine uses the fantasy genre to connect to everyday pains and everyday embarrassments that are quite dramatic for us, The Lagoon takes the things that we subsume and the things that we push down and brings it to the surface in a story that takes place almost entirely at night. Spooky but beautiful and sad, number 6 on my list, The Lagoon by Lily Carey. Now, I know I said I'm going to include all subgenres of fantasy, and we've been dealing with things that are about fairy tales and about folk tales, things that replicate or directly refer to these kind of stories. But the list may seem to some of you to be lacking the good old RPG type of fantasy. What about the dwarves? What about the elves? Although we did have Elfquest. What about all the magic spells and the combat, halflings and the thieves and the rogues and things like that? My next comic is not only one of the best comics to deal with the RPG Dungeons and Dragons type of fantasy, but also one of the funniest. In fact, not only did I know that this comic was definitely going to make my top 10 fantasy comics list, but I also know that were I to make a funniest comics I've ever read list today, this comic would also be on that. I'm talking about The Order of the Stick, written and drawn by Rich Burlew. The Order of the Stick is a webcomic. You can read every single story in these 6 volumes and more online for free at Rich Burlew's website, The Giant in the Playground. The Giant in the Playground is a Dungeons & Dragons tabletop gaming site, and Rich Burlew started this comic strip as entertainment for people who are visiting the sites, running gags and jokes that are based on the good old dice rolling Dungeons & Dragons gameplay. You've got a fighter, a wizard, you've got a rogue, you've got a dwarven cleric, and right at the start, the comic is full of D&D in-jokes about evasion and going up a level and going down a level while dungeon crawling and things like that. But it quickly evolves into a deep, layered, complex story that spans continents, that has universe-altering consequences. There's death, there's heaven, there's resurrection, there are philosophical meanderings about life, there are flashbacks to backstory, there are plot twists and double crosses. It is truly one of the most epic stories, while all being very, very funny. Because Rich Burlew published this story one page at a time, each page has a gag comic sort of structure. That means that you have a setup and you have a punchline on almost every single page. At the same time, those pages connect directly to the next one to propel the story forward. Sometimes, just like newspaper comic strips, you'll have several pages that are just one conversation between two characters, characters. Sometimes you will have a huge jump in time or a huge jump in location for the next panel. It's amazing comic storytelling. Do not be fooled by the fact that they are stick figures, and that's why they are called the Order of the Stick. That's a conscious artistic choice taken to tell this story in a particular way, but the simplistic looking artwork actually is quite complicated. Just by putting a blonde wig on someone, he can completely change what the character looks like, which then becomes part of the story of how someone's impersonating someone else. The gender and race questions within D&D are played for humor by using this art style, but also the complexity I mentioned, where the story twists and turns in a way that reminds me of epic fantasy like Tolkien, epic fantasy like Bone, things like Avatar: The Last Airbender, where mythos and character and twists and turns are all blended together seamlessly. The fact that it's so funny based on character, based on situation, based on choices people are making, and the wit that they have in their interplay, along with the fact that the story can also have surprising pathos when you learn about someone's background, when you learn about their family situation, when you see the struggle that they have behind the comedy, behind the hijinks. The fact that these two things can both be so potent at the same time really makes Order of the Stick one of the most remarkable comics I've read. I have trouble reading things digitally, especially things that are made for print, but the fact that this is a webcomic means it's designed to be read online, and I've actually enjoyed reading over 100 pages of it online. I did end up buying the self-published volumes. I have 6 of them over here, and I think there'll be more coming out. It has my highest and most gleeful recommendation. Similar to the spoofing kind of nature of the Order of the Stick, but taking a slightly different angle at it, is Dungeon by Louis Trondheim, Joan Svar, Emmanuel Goubert, and others, called Donjon in French, I believe. And although this isn't quite making my list, I would be remiss not to mention it next to the Order of the Stick. Like the Order of the Stick, this European comic is a playful goof on Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy tropes of that kind. It does contain violence and slapstick humor and adult situations right next to some very silly happenings, which may seem like a weird combination, but it seems to work so well for creating this oddball world. It's got castles and wizards and monsters, but at the same time it also has very peculiar characters, some of whom, including the protagonist of the main series, are completely clueless. But again, the stories twist and turn in such ways, with such a interesting mixture of loving send-up and dedicated following of tropes, that I found myself completely charmed. I think Dungeon is designed as a never-ending story. There are 3 parallel timelines in the present, which is represented in the Zenith comics. There's the past, which is the early years. There's the future, which is Twilight. And the volumes are published in all kinds of order. So you'll continue the story of the future, then come back and read a story that's set in the present, which will inform that. So even from the design of the publishing of these stories, which I think has been happening for over a decade, it's a completely unique fantasy experience and a pretty funny one to boot. In my almost top 10 fantasy video, I mentioned the Conan stories by Kurt Busiek, Carrie Nord, and especially Greg Ruth. I did say that there was a book of Greg Ruth's that I loved, which is what actually led me to finally pick up those Conan volumes. And it's that book that's my number 4 pick. This is The Lost Boy, written and drawn by Greg Ruth. The Lost Boy is done in this wonderful charcoal, black and white, etched style that I found to be absolutely beautiful. But also beautiful is this story of this boy who finds this old tape recorder that belongs to another boy from many decades ago who went missing. Following the voice diary on these old reels, this boy undertakes a journey that takes him from this world that we know and slowly slips into a completely different world that exists right alongside ours. In the background, there is always the mystery of what happened to that other boy. There are stories like this that we've seen both before and following The Lost Boy, but few of them have truly, to me, created this world of fantasy that is exactly like our world. So if you have a bug that talks, this is not now a cartoon bug. This bug looks just like the bug looks to you and me. It just happens to talk. If you put a top hat on that bug or a tailcoat on that bug, it looks like a bug wearing a top hat. The fact that what is fantastical and what is magical is so very close and so very recognizable if we were to only open our eyes is one of the things in fantasy stories that I've always enjoyed. And this story by Greg Ruth, in its scope, ambition, but particularly that final execution, is perhaps the best example of that I've seen. Number 3 on my list is Children of the Sea by Daisuke Igarashi. Now, I know that I said I'm going to go in an order of least known, and I'm very sure that at least some of you will tell me that this is not a little known comic. This is a very famous and established comic, and I'm completely willing to accept that. It's just that when I get recommendations for manga, and I get a lot of recommendations of manga, very few people seem to mention this, or I think only one person has ever mentioned this comic, and I think that this is one of the most spectacular manga that I've read. The only reason I would have left it off the list is because I haven't finished it, and I know I said that I don't put incomplete things, but this is a little different from Berserk, where I've only read the first of like 12 or 13 volumes. This is, I've read half the story, and there is enough in this to let me know that this is one of the best fantasy comics I've read. Children of the Sea is a magical story about a boy who meets a girl and they can both breathe underwater, and it goes from there. It is one of the best examples I've seen of underwater fantasy. It perfectly captures this kind of wish fulfillment aspect of what if I could breathe underwater? What would I find over there? What if I could talk underwater? Are there things that I could communicate with underwater? At the same time, it is delicate and beautiful in its story about family and about relationships, and the way that life on land affects behavior in the water and the other way around is truly magical. Even just the first volume is so beautiful and captured my imagination to such an extent that there was no way that I would be leaving it out of my top 10 fantasy comics. Number 2 on my list is Sailor Twain, or The Mermaid in the Hudson, written and drawn by Mark Siegel. Set in 1887, 1888 in the United States, where riverboats for the super rich have made a lot of money for a company, and tells the story of a sailor who encounters a mermaid. This could be one of those things that's like magical realism, where it's one fantastical element, but the role that the mermaid plays, the way that the story unfolds around that mermaid is absolutely fantasy. There are many things to love about this book. The themes of desire and duty and responsibility, human life versus fantastical other life, or even the possibility of that, are more richly and more complexly explored than any other mermaid story I've read. But it's also not a sanitized fairy tale mermaid. This is not the safest creature to be around. This isn't The Shape of Water, in which it's just a tremendous love story. This is dangerous, and you as the reader can feel the danger. The characters in it may also feel it, but there are other forces pulling them towards decisions that are not necessarily the right ones. And Mark Siegel's incredible pencil art style with shading, you would think that this would look unfinished, like the drawings of a particularly adept child in their exercise book, but it doesn't. It creates an ethereal, timeless sort of feel for the story, which as it escalates and as it comes to its crescendo, achieves something that very few fantasy comics do. It makes you feel really scared while being absolutely enraptured by the beauty of what you're looking at. I wouldn't call this a love story by any means, but it's a very ambitious tale of love and lust done with delicacy and poetry in a way that I absolutely adore. If you're willing to take a chance on a rich and textured fairy tale that isn't quite a fairy tale, I highly recommend Sailor Twain. Another honorable mention over here, very similar to Sailor Twain in many ways, is Sparks, the subject of my perhaps the best comic you've never heard of video. Sparks' subtitle is An Urban Fairy Tale. It is an urban fantasy, and I talk about it at length in that video. When I think about that one magical element taking over an entire story built on what we think of as familiar tales and stories, but putting a different, a realistic, a sadder, maybe darker twist on it, I find Sparks and Sailor Twain to occupy that same space. I'm not putting Sparks on this list, but I had to mention it. And finally, the number one comic on my list, which again is number one just because this is the book I hear people talking the least about of all of these, although you could mix them around. And this is another one of those where I'm breaking my own rules because my final comic for this video is The Motherless Oven by Rob Davis. The Motherless Oven is actually the first volume in a 3-volume story. The first volume is The Motherless Oven, the second is The Can Opener's Daughter, and the third one is to be released later this year. So yes, this is an incomplete story. I haven't finished it, and I'm putting it on my list. But just like Children of the Sea and unlike Berserk or Conan, this isn't the tip of the iceberg where most of it remains to be read. 2 acts out of 3 are, in this case, are more than enough to convince me that The Motherless Oven is a terrific fantasy comic. The world that this story is set in is perhaps one of the most unusual and bizarre worlds I've seen in comics, and that's saying a lot. By that I mean that you are trying to puzzle out the way this world works while the characters themselves, who are completely used to the way the world works, are trying to puzzle out why the world is the way it is. Which means that everything that seems strange to you is normal to the characters over here, and the things they're interested in uncovering is a second layer. As a reader, you have to first understand that this is a world where children make their own parents, quite literally out of cardboard or paper or metal. Their parents can be engines or pieces of art. The clocks tell you when it's knife o'clock, when knives start raining down, but a rebellious teenager can pick up a table and walk out into the rain of knives if she wants to. The way that the high school drama is transposed into this utterly bizarre world, and the way that teen angst becomes about questioning the reality that they live in and why are things the way they are and who's in charge of things if it's not them, because if you make your own parents, then who really is in charge, is some of the headiest and most entertaining fantasy fiction I've read, comics or otherwise. The first volume is an incredible roller coaster ride. You will be left with, at the end, with more questions than you had at the beginning, which could be frustrating if there wasn't a second volume out when you read the first volume, which was the case with me. So I had to wait for this to come out. The second volume definitely, thankfully, provides a lot of answers, although don't take that to mean a simple answer, but leaves you with such a cliffhanger that 2020 could not get here fast enough for me. I suppose it is possible that the third volume will completely take the story off the rails, but with the confidence and style and bravado that this comic has displayed so far, I seriously doubt it. When I think about fantasy, I want to be surprised, I want to be illuminated, I want to be perplexed, and I want to be rewarded all at the same time. All of the comics that I've talked about over here definitely do it in some way or the other, but I hope I've been able to highlight for you some of the different ways in which we can get the same things we yearn for from fantasy stories from a variety of different approaches. There are literally dozens of titles I had to leave off this list, most of which you will see in some form or the other on my shelf videos already up, and that I will spotlight in future videos. Let me know what you thought of this selection. If there are closer looks you would like at any of these books, leave that in the comments below. And I'd love to know what your top 10 or your favorite fantasy comics are. Leave it all in the comments below. Thank you as always for watching. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next video.